Okay, so we're going to talk about log file monitoring and what we've done here. We've set up some basic log file monitoring so that when you install ArcShell, it automatically starts monitoring the operating system log files. And let me just show you how that works. And so one, you'll understand how this works, but you'll understand how easily you can apply this to all kinds of log files. And what you create here is now repeatable, deliverable. You can share your solution. My solution is going to run fine on your operating system. And if not, just a few tweaks and it will run fine on your operating system and everybody else's. And it's out of the box. You just install the software and it starts running. So let's get started. So you remember maybe in the last video, if you watched it, we set up a schedule, and all we had to do to set up a schedule is create a directory and put a schedule.config file in there. And there's only two values to set. One is like a cron expression, and one is whether it's enabled or disabled. So we can disable the schedule entirely if we want. And then we created a file, or I created a file called monitor OS logs. And so in this example, I'm sourcing in ArcShell, and I'm checking to see if I'm running an auxiliary instance. Auxiliary instance just means, you may have more than one copy of ArcShell installed on a particular host in different user accounts. This kind of job monitoring the OS logs only needs to be done by one of those accounts, not all of them. So, you want to name one of your instances the primary instance, and that's the default. And then if you install ArcShell more than once on a server, the other instances you need to mark as auxiliary instances. And that's just in your .arcshell file that you source in right here. There's a parameter called aux instance. You just change that to 1. So we're going to go ahead and acquire a lock here. Try up to 5 times, 5 seconds. The lock will terminate after 1200 seconds automatically, even if we don't release it, if something crashes or something. And we're calling the lock monitor OS logs. Okay, if we can't acquire the lock, we exit false. And now what we do is, if the syslog file exists, we did some logging there. I guess I did duplicate. I've got to actually fix this. I'll get rid of that. Okay, we'll fix that later. So what we do is we do a logmon read log, maximum of 10 megabytes. So if it starts getting written to really heavily, we're not like reading tons and tons of data. It'll throw an error and let us know that it maxed out, which is usually an indication that there's some kind of issue. And so we'll know about that and we can always come look at the log manually. So we're going to, basically this just will return new lines on the log file. We can just call this as many times as we want. If there's new lines, those get returned. And then that gets passed to logmon handle log. We're telling it that we're piping the input data in here through standard in. And then we just name the log handler. And in this case, it's var syslog. If we do syslog.out file, it's var syslog. If we have a messages file, we've created a var log messages, and then we check to see if the dmessage program exists. If it does exist, we pipe that to a sensor. We say that we only care about new lines in the sensor, call it dmessage sensor, and then if that senses new lines, that gets piped to our logmon handle log, and we have a file set up for that. So this is all it took to set up 24/7 log file monitoring on any OS that's running ArcShell will have all this, and you have a lot of ability to configure your monitoring. So let's go look at one of these files. We'll look at most of them are pretty basic starters. These are kind of the basic things I look for the most part when I'm looking at a file for the first time. Here I was playing around with something, and I'll just explain what's going on here. We're not going to get into these commands too much. We'll teach you about that later. But what we're doing here is we have this idea of buffers. You start with buffer 0, and then you can put things in other buffers and just work with those buffers. So you're just kind of moving stuff around into files, shuffling things around and working on it, and piecemealing it in chunks. And so here we're extracting all the values that match, that have cron in them, and we're writing that to buffer 1. We're then grepping from buffer 1 the word error. So basically we would filter out all the cron stuff, get it out so it couldn't trigger, none of this could trigger down here. We'd get all those, we would extract those lines from buffer 0, put them in buffer 1, and then we would send a message, a notice, if there was a match on error. And so then we go back and we're at buffer, this is going to default to buffer 0. We're grepping for all these values, and then we're sending a message. And I'll show you what that kind of looks like. This is what it looks like right now. So, you know, you get a message, and this was syslog notice. Obviously, warning is probably what triggered that, and this is probably something we're going to be filtering out because it probably isn't worth getting an email on or even logging for that point. And so that's what you do. You kind of refine your filters as you get data. Let's see. I wanted to show one other thing. What was it? Okay, I remember what it was. So the keyword here, this goes back to the config that we talked about when you went through the install process, if you watch those videos. So we have these things called keywords, and so this is the keyword notice, and you can see that I'm configured to send a text not 0 and send email yes, so that would send an email. If I wanted to, I could change you know, this to critical, and now I'm getting a text when any of these happen. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you necessarily do this. This is shell, so you can you can write if statements and things like that. You could put a variable in here, and then up here have an if then else or a case statement. Set your variable, so you're setting your keyword for the appropriate type of environment. Most of the time, those are going to be in some fairly general categories like tags and whether it's prod or non-prod, things like that. We'll probably also have a way of de-escalating a message where you can change critical to something else dynamically, kind of using a hook, the concept of a hook, if you're familiar with what that is, or a trigger. So before the message is sent, it would actually intercept the keyword and maybe downgrade it on a particular server. And that gives you the ability to basically write scripts one way for everywhere, but in non-prod or less important environments, you're not necessarily getting alerted as often or as frequently because they aren't as important. So, okay, so that's all I've got for this video. That's how we set up messaging. So that is built into ArcShell now. And thanks for watching.